So this is step 2 of the Eightfold Path. We're going to start with a review of the first step, which is right view. That's the last video. But I want to start with a reminder too, heavy emphasis. This is my understanding and my application of the Noble Eightfold Path. Okay, people are allowed to disagree. They're allowed to say, I don't know what I'm talking about. That's fine. Part of my understanding of the Buddha and his teachings comes from his first set of writings in the Kalama Sutta, in which he says there should be no dogma. There should be no intolerance of each other. Okay, if you want to experience truth, we can drop our judgments of each other. And so I'm like, I request tolerance because it works pretty well. But that's okay. You're allowed to disagree. All right. So this is my perception and application of, especially from a therapeutic level, of the Noble Eightfold Path. So to do the review of the right view, first I'm going to just quickly mention something called the Four Noble Truths. That's a big part of it. And what are those Four Noble Truths? The Buddha taught that all of us have something in common. We all suffer. That's the first truth. We suffer because of attachments. What are we attached to? Our expectations and physical concepts and ideas, our perspective, sometimes our politics. We're attached to these things. And since we're attached to them, and because they're not guaranteed, we end up suffering as a result. The way to stop suffering is through detachment. That's the third step of the Noble Truths. And the fourth step to get there, to be good at it, is to do the Eightfold Path, which is why we're proceeding to step 2, okay? So to do a review of Right View, last night I finished watching this series called Beef. I think it's on Netflix. Anybody watch that? Okay, I think it was Netflix. I think it won some Golden Globes, and it's quite interesting. It's a story of a man and a woman who get into a road rage incident. And I'm only ruining a little bit of it. By the end, they end up having this interesting connection happen, you know? But the last episode was the one that I watched last night. And they said 4 different things, more than that, but they said 4 different things that made me think these are Buddhist producers and directors. Whoever wrote this has to be Buddhist, because they were just pretty much quoting directly, I believe, from concepts from Right View. And so I wrote them down over here from the series Beef. The woman at one point says, I thought my baby was going to complete me. And right away I thought, well, that's anicca. In Right View, anicca is impermanence. Impermanence is Buddha's teaching that anything that can change will be unsatisfying. Anything that can change form or deteriorates or decays will eventually cause suffering. That is what is known as dukkha, suffering and unsatisfactory. And so babies can change, right? They don't stay the same size. Their personalities change. And babies are just symbolic of like everything else in the world that changes. You know, you get your new car, your house, your relationship or whatever. They're going to change. Everything changes. And everything ends up leading towards suffering as a result. If we don't learn the path of the Eightfold Path, if we don't learn that, then we're going to suffer as a result. And that's why her baby doesn't complete her. You know, that child's going to grow up and things are going to change. Another thing that they said, the man and woman are talking back and forth. One of them says, talking about the nature of reality, it's like a void, but not. It's empty, but solid. And they're getting deep into the philosophy of that, right? I'm like, hey, we just talked about that last week. What is that? Well, that's the problem of duality. Is it dual or is it unified somehow? Remember we talked about Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, think of your 10-year-old self. Is that different than your current self? Or is it the same? Do you identify with your 10-year-old self in some ways? But in other ways, are you different? Sure. Is an acorn different than an oak tree? Yes. But aren't they the same at the same time? Isn't an oak tree a very well-developed acorn? Yes. And Thich Nhat Hanh says you really can't proceed with the Eightfold Path unless you understand that. It seems like it's dual, but it's not. These two things are actually the same. Different variations, Einstein said in equals mc squared, different variations of the same thing. And so, yeah, we live in a universe that's empty, but it's solid. Do you get it? If so, we can proceed. The one character says, why did God make it like this? They're both suffering by the end of this, right? They're struggling with stuff. And like, why did God make it like this? And the other character answers, well, if God is everything, then we are God. Interesting. So who made it like this? Based upon the way the question is framed, it means us. It's a line from Course in Miracles. The secret to salvation is this. We're doing this to ourselves, okay? It reminds me of this wonderful set of verses in Scripture, in the Bible. Psalms 82:16. God himself says, ye are gods, all of you are children of the Most High, said by God, okay? Well, Jesus doubled down on that when he was being called a blasphemer for saying he's the Son of God in John 10:34, and he repeats that quote. Hey, isn't it written in your book that God himself said ye are gods? Now, I personally like to read a lot of different Christians trying to wiggle the way around this concept instead of reading it for what it says specifically, backed up by Jesus here. And a whole lot of gymnastics mentally is made to get it to, well, that he doesn't really mean that. Okay. Now I like to say, oh yeah, he does, because it's a small g. I put it there on purpose. It's a small g. We're not God. We are of God, though. And that's very important, given that Jesus said we're the light. And so the journey that we're working on and what the Eightfold Path about too is something the Buddha said. He's not Buddha to be worshipped. He recognized the Buddha nature inside himself, which means to wake up. And then he said, you're Buddha too. It's the same thing, Jesus says, ultimately. Now that we all have the ability to be God. Small g doesn't make you God, but to know the truth and all of that. And it's not, what I like to call it is Occam's razor. Let's look at it the most simple assumption. And when Jesus says you're gods, and God himself said that, children of the Most High, all of us, then I'm going to take it seriously. Well, all it means is that we all have the ability to understand these great truths and be the very light Jesus says that we are. Okay? Enlightenment comes to mind. It's to bring the light to. So everything, if God is everything, then we are God. Yeah, absolutely right. We are all thoughts in God's mind, so to speak. And that's our job, to connect to that source. One of the last lines in the show, we should have done this more often. They appreciated the fact they had this conversation. Well, it reminded me immediately of this wonderful line that I heard years ago now from, I think it's in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, but it was a Buddhist quote. We in Tibet spend our whole life preparing to die. You in America spend your whole life hoping you won't die. Okay? And I think that's spot on. But it also taps into this concept. We should have done this more often. In America, at least, we don't really sit around talking about deep philosophy and unity very often, do we? Especially during election years, okay? In fact, we think we're totally right to dig into our perspective and argue and call people names. That's what we think. Well, good luck getting to where we need to go. I was listening to a Instagram. The man's name was Sebastian Engies. And you can look it up on Instagram. It's called Don't Be a Baby Bird. So many of us, and all of us for a while, just take, like baby birds, take what's regurgitated to us, right? Take that what someone else chewed up and then spit into us. And we take that as the truth. A lot of religion is like that. Well, this is what I got taught. We got taught by people who got taught by people who got taught by people, on and on and on. One of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha is that's no way to do it. Back to the no dogma, right? Back to the no bigotry and no fanaticism. Learn for yourself what truth is. That's the only way that you know that it's true. It's what I learned therapeutically again. What's very valuable is when someone experiences something like forgiveness, they know that it's true. It works every time. It works like a charm. And the brain has this amazing ability of giving us chemistry to back it up. Things like endorphins and serotonin and GABA and dopamine get produced by the brain when we think certain ways. When you have had the experience, you really don't need dogma anymore. And so that's the baby bird example of don't take what someone else regurgitated to you. Have your own direct experience of it. Okay? And then Thich Nhat Hanh, he said this, because a lot of what right view is about getting rid of opposites. He says, eliminating opposites has the power to transport us to the shores of freedom. That's Thich Nhat Hanh. Doesn't that sound good? Instead of looking at things from the dualistic perspective, we're supposed to somehow see it as unified. That includes life and death. They're not what we think we are, what we think it is. We don't have a physical life and then a physical death that is so dramatically different than the experience we're having right now. We have to somehow unify them, not as polar opposites, but as somehow unifying quality. And what we call good and bad. Don't eat off that tree. There isn't that type of good and bad. The tree of life, as it says in Scripture, is what the whole process of the Eightfold Path is about. Somehow we have to learn how to eliminate those opposites. And it's maybe hardest to do when we're told to love our enemies. What is an enemy? It's someone who's against me or opposite of my perspective. Well, in order to get to these shores of freedom, we have to learn how to eliminate such opposites, right? Okay, so that's the quick review of right view. And the essence of it you want to get down to is that if you're suffering because, again, Buddha's teaching, because of the inability or ignorance, ultimately, of these opposites. It's not what we think it is. There's a world that is shaping us. It's why I like to use the physics a lot. The way the world works in physical law, natural law, is actually teaching and grooming all of us to walk this path, whether we want to or not. Okay, so that's right view reviewed. Now we can do the second step of the Eightfold Path, called right intention. Now, it's also called right thought. There's a couple different descriptions of it out there. But I personally like, again, therapeutically, intention feels right to me for a bunch of different reasons, but thought is really close. And so there's a couple different ways to characterize it. Just it's not as deep and involved, but a lot of what right intention about is understanding right view. Like Thich Nhat Hanh said, it's hard, or you probably can't proceed with step 2 and the rest of them unless you get right view. But with right intention, what we're doing is understanding right view and trying to spread that, trying to share that. So we'll walk through a couple different ways of thinking of it. One, I read a Buddhist teacher said that this right intention is not an intellectual exercise. It's ultimately an attitude of the heart towards humanity, towards the world. Okay, and so it's ultimately cultivating this intention towards everyone, towards everyone in your life, towards all beings. This basic idea of understanding right view, and you'll see why therapeutically that's so valuable. So what is right intention with right thought? It's applying the mind to cultivate, ultimately, an attitude of the heart, which of course is going to be love-based. I think that should be pretty obvious, okay? Well, how do we do that? So there's 3 basic steps in right intention. First is renunciation. And renunciation is a way of rejecting that which we have been addicted to in many ways. It could easily be things like drugs and alcohol, that's obvious, okay? But it's also stuff like perspective. Rejecting this idea that you know best because this is what you were told and your religion is correct because this and that, right? I remember reading a Hindu teaching once, if you want to access truth, you should give up all your opinions. And your opinions are conditioned after all. You have yours because where you were born and who your mommy and daddy were and what culture you were in. I have mine for the same reasons, right? So truth can only be experienced by giving up all of that. We have to renunciate the way we got conditioned, right? You can renunciate drugs, you can renunciate alcohol, you could do it with food, you could do it like in my case with stop hating on Tom Brady, stuff like that. There's so many different ways to do it, but we have to practice it. We are practicing non-craving, non-dogma, and having an open mind. You have to practice, like again, is English the best language? Are there other ways people in the world can communicate? Why don't we ever argue about that? English is superior to French and Spanish and whatever. Because we get it right away. I'm like, well, that's obvious. Why? Because they just got taught that language because that's where they were born. Why don't we do that with everything else? Right? Language we get. But the truth is we have to open our mind up to all aspects of dogma. Well, maybe their perspective is accurate given the way they were raised. True, right? And so renunciation is practicing giving up that which we are wired to do, especially holding on to our perspectives like this is the right one. But we can also practice it with stuff like not eating foods or drinking or using drugs or whatever that might be bad for us. That's just a way to cultivate right view. Practicing goodwill, right? To actually look at other people and root them, root for them. To want people to succeed, right? To want people to be happy. We're going to get into that more with something called the 4 measurables, but goodwill is an attitude of the heart. Do you wake up in the morning wanting other people to suffer? Or do you wake up in the morning hoping other people do better? Do you want your enemy to suffer? Or do you want them to do better? Okay, that's important. To do what Thich Nhat Hanh said and reach the shores of freedom, you're going to have to practice rooting on your enemy, okay? Not to succeed physically. There's barely any physical talk in any of this. It's to have your enemy also learn this one way or another, okay? And then to do no harm. Again, it's just a practice. It's a mental discipline that we turn into a behavioral one. We'll get into that in the coming steps as well. But do no harm. What does that mean? We should practice not harming things, okay? You should want to not harm things. We should not want there to be wars. Of course, that goes without saying. But we shouldn't want people to get sick or lose their jobs and all that kind of stuff. Again, a good Buddhist is practicing not harming people in many different ways. And then again, that's cultivating this attitude, okay? Now, the 4 measurables is another part of Buddhism, and I think it fits perfectly right here. And the 4 measurables are very specific ideas that are part of, that fit into right intention quite nicely. And they're easy to think about. One is loving kindness. And from it, it's in the word the Buddha used is called metta, right? And I love, again, as a therapist, to have people practice the metta prayer. And the metta prayer is when you mindfully wish for other people to feel happy and to feel well. Okay? It's quite the prayer. It doesn't mean you have to go hug your enemy. You definitely don't have to go vote for your enemy. But sending loving kindness, energy, and compassion, or all types of the good energy towards your enemy is a wonderful prayer to do. It will certainly help heal you. And again, it's cultivating this. It's one of the measurables. The next one is compassion. And to cultivate compassion is to recognize this. I like to compare it between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is when you feel other people's pain. And sympathy is when, that's unfortunate that they're in that situation. You're glad you're not them. I often say, sucks to be you, right? Empathy is you join with someone in the process, but you don't feel bad for them. That's so important. Because that's telling people that their circumstances are wrong, okay? And there's nothing about this process that says something is wrong. Everything is as the way it needs to be, okay? And good therapy is reaching people and understanding whatever you're going through, there's a larger context here, okay? Much larger context. Don't eat off the tree of good and bad, right? The fact is everyone is walking this same walk together. And compassion is to feel other people's pain, but to put your arm around them and say, you got this. We're going to learn together. Let's support each other during this. But to believe that their experience is valid and important part of the process, okay? That's compassion. Empathetic joy, which is mudita, which is instead of hating on Tom Brady for so many years, I finally learned I should practice being happy for the guy, okay? And empathetic joy is when you can look an enemy in the eye and say, good for you. Maybe I'll get you next time, that kind of thing. But it's to, as the Dalai Lama says, with me, 1 chance for happiness. With whole world, 8 billion chances. What if we rooted everybody else on? What if we weren't jealous of each other all the time? Gee, I want what you have. Americans know the word jealousy. Well, if we said, what's the opposite of jealousy? We don't know. We don't have a word for it. Not a good one, anyways. Well, mudita, which is cultivating right intention and right view, is to practice being happy for other people, especially when you want it. It's really hard in America, given how competitive we are. But it's a wonderful way to cultivate it. And last is equanimity, which is the ultimately concept is that you can maintain, especially if you get into the Eightfold Path and you get good at the later stages, maintain a nice, balanced, even temper, right? You could be focused all the time on staying at peace, independent if something good or bad is happening, right? Your recognition that we have to go through these waves of up and down of what seems like good and bad, your recognition that that's a guarantee, that suffering is going to happen, helps keep you ultimately at stoic, right? You could be at peace as a result. And it doesn't ever say, this is fun, yay? It's not about, looking at a situation and like wishing it upon yourself. It's going to happen anyways. But equanimity it means you're going to stay there, okay? So that's part of right intention. Now, from a therapeutic perspective, what I like about right intention is it helps you understand the real reason why you suffer, but why other people suffer too. And it's so easy to notice another person who might be suffering and go straight to their physical circumstances. So what's unifying in all this is the Buddha from the very beginning. He doesn't say we suffer because something physically bad happens. It reminds me of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, who went through the Holocaust, for goodness sakes. And he said it wasn't what happened to him in the Holocaust. He lost his wife and his parents. They were killed in a concentration camp. But in Man's Search for Meaning, he says it wasn't what happened to him that causes his feelings. It's the story he tells himself about what happens to him. Because if you give something meaning, you can just change the narrative you just experienced. So yeah, bad things happen in the physical world as we experience them, but we make them worse or we make them bad when we think of them that way. And so the key is to recognize that people suffer, and again, it's not the same as feeling bad or sad. Sad is a healthy human emotion. There's nothing wrong with feeling sad. Now, not many people are happy at grandma's funeral, okay? That's not the point, but you can be peaceful. It's when we get grief-stricken and we're dragged into the suffering area where it becomes dysfunctional. And why? Why is it happening? It's because we don't have the awareness of this path. It's just called ignorance in Buddhism. We suffer out of the ignorance and then not recognizing that there's a pathway to follow and that the world isn't as we think it is. It's not as we seem. Buddha called the world an illusion, so did Albert Einstein. Okay? That's sort of important. Illusion means has a deceptive appearance. So it's very therapeutic and it gives us great clarity. So you can have an experience of a negative experience, shall we say, and maintain equanimity because you understand the process. Okay? And so ultimately, Thich Nhat Hanh also said, intention is often not love. Okay? You might have a good intention, but what are most human intentions about? Helping humans feel better. Okay? Well, if we help humans feel better by ignorance, which is ultimately fixing things physically, it is not going to work. It's just going to lead to more attachment. Now, no one, especially me right now, is saying we shouldn't give to charity, for example. Of course we should do that, but we should do it with awareness. There's a million teachings on, in the Bible that look like contradictions. Stuff like Jesus saying, I didn't come to bring peace, from what's known as the Prince of Peace, right? I came to bring his sword, he says. But then he also said, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Blessed are the poor, right? So then why do we, and rich men have a hard time getting into the kingdom of heaven. Why do we take from the rich to give to the poor? Shouldn't we make them more poor? I mean, there's contradictions all over the place, okay? That's because it's not about physical stuff like that. There's important teachings there, but the depth matters so much more. The way we help other people is often not love, says Thich Nhat Hanh, because we are projecting what we think will make them happy. Well, you remember right view? What makes us unhappy? Attachment. What makes us happy then? Detachment. So what should we be working on with each other? Well, detachment, according to the Buddha. According to Thich Nhat Hanh, okay? If we can practicing the four measurables would help, practice renunciation. And again, there's nothing wrong at all in any way with having material possessions, right? There's nothing wrong with money inherently. It's how you use it, right? But what makes people happy, whether they have money or not, is understanding these truths. That detaching from our physical world perspectives will lead to ultimately step 8 in this process, samadhi. And with that comes nirvana, and the kingdom of heaven is inside of you, like Jesus said, and all of that. And my experience in the addiction world too, a whole lot of good dope inside your own head because you practice this stuff, okay? So Thich Nhat Hanh says, be careful, because our intention is usually to try to help people. What we have to do is help them help their souls. The awakening quality is what makes people feel better. Otherwise, we could still be listening to Elvis at age 85 or so, right? I mean, unfortunately, he had it all, but and I don't know if he had all the right view and the right intention and all that. Not judging, I'm just saying. Okay, so I like to close tying right intention into a wonderful line from Course in Miracles and what we were just talking about. Course in Miracles at the very end of the opening section says, it's called Choose Once Again, that we all have a choice to be among the saviors of the world or remain in hell and keep your brothers there. Well, that's interesting. First of all, it's suggesting that we can be among the saviors of the world. Well, that's straight up, no, you're gods, okay? Well, what's a savior of the world anyways? A savior of the world would be someone who understands right view and brings it to other people, right? And this is exactly what Buddha and Thich Nhat Hanh are talking about. That you want to help people feel good, help them get out of their own trap. Remember Matrix, when Morpheus says we're all in a prison, right? A prison for our minds. Well, good luck getting out of that prison physically. And again, Apostle Paul, who was in prison, said he wasn't in prison. He said the guards were in prison. They didn't even know it. Because we are in prison for our minds. When you believe in yourself as physical, foremost, primarily a physical being, not a child of God, children of the Most High, right? If you don't perceive yourself that way, you'll be in a prison, and then you'll suffer. And so the saviors of the world are people who are interested to bring right view, right intention, and then the rest of them to everyone else. You should also, if you want, donate to charity, right? And help the little old lady across the street. And those are all wonderful things to do. But do it with this spirit. That's right intention. If you're only doing things because you feel bad for people, then you're not trusting the universe. And many people have ulterior motives. Kabbalah teaches that what is outer giving is usually inner taking. We do things for other people so we can feel better about ourselves, right? I couldn't live with myself if I didn't rescue that cat from the tree, right? And our ego feels better. How much did you give to charity? I gave twice as much as you. I'm therefore better, okay? Ego work. Nothing to do with any of that. What we can do to be among the saviors of the world is to present, through right intention, goodwill, loving kindness, and attitude of the heart. And it includes dealing with people in difficult circumstances. And you say to them, you've got this. Why did Jesus hang out with the poor and the meek and the weak and all of that kind of stuff? They were most open. They were the most ready to get rid of the ego, okay? They didn't want to deal with that stuff anymore. Who's difficult to reach with this? Well, the rich man, of course, the egotistical, the ones who are super into the physical world, the ones with power, presidents and congressmen and all that. They're not sitting around talking about this. My life, addicts will do that, though. They'll get into this. They're like, oh, yeah, that makes some sense. Plus, they like getting high, like me. I like to get high naturally, okay? And that's the promise at the end of this. Step 8 is the high, okay? It is the nirvana experience. And to get good at that, you have to choose among the saviors of the world. Do you want to remain in hell and keep your brother there, okay? Why is that? Because if you keep working on physical world solution for things, ego level development, like the rest of the world's been doing forever, if we just had more money to share, the Buddha had millions and he was practically suicidal. Then he gave it all up and he started to feel better. Then he realized, okay, the balanced path. And his salvation, if you will, came to him when he understood all this stuff. His resurrection, his enlightenment, all of that. And he knew that it wasn't going to be found through money. And it's not that we should get rid of it either. It's just understanding that to remain in hell is to maintain our addiction to the physical world perspective. So it's quite the journey to get through. Again, this is step 2 of 8. Next time we'll review 1 and 2 quickly, and then continue cultivating, okay? Because the goal is to really nail right view, and then learn how to bring it through yourself into the whole world. And then last couple stages get us really focused on doing that exact thing, okay? So that's our choice. You want to be among the saviors of the world and work on understanding this stuff and really get good at it from the Buddhist perspective, or remain in hell. I want to leave that in this time. Doesn't that look cool?
That does look pretty cool.